They said love could never cross the canyon. But when Jake Marston found her bleeding by the water's edge, everything he knew about right and wrong began to fade with the setting sun. Jake Marston had learned to live with silence, the kind that settles into your bones after war, after loss, after watching good men fall for causes that stop making sense somewhere between the first bullet and the last. He'd been a Union scout once, tracking movements, reading trails, keeping soldiers alive in a land that wanted them dead. But that was before he'd seen enough death to last 3 lifetimes, before he'd walked away from the uniform and found himself a patch of earth near Red Mesa Canyon, where the only company he kept was his own shadow and the wind that carried memories he'd rather forget. The cabin he built sat at the edge of 2 worlds. To the east, settler towns pushing westward with their churches and their certainties. To the west, Apache territory, vast, ancient and unforgiving to those who didn't understand its laws. Jake understood enough to know he understood nothing. He kept to himself, hunted only what he needed, respected the boundaries that weren't marked on any map but were real as stone. That evening in late summer, the sky bled crimson and gold. Jake had ridden out to check his traps near the canyon's rim, where the Colorado River carved its eternal path through red rock. The heat still clung to the earth, even as the sun dipped low. And that's when he heard it. Not quite a sound, more like the absence of sound. The kind of quiet that makes a man's instincts scream. He dismounted slowly, hand resting on the revolver at his hip. His horse nickered, uneasy. Jake moved through the scrub brush, eyes scanning the shadows between the rocks. And then he saw her. An Apache woman, collapsed near the water's edge, her dark hair spread across the red sand like spilled ink. Blood soaked through the deerskin of her dress, dark and fresh. For a moment, just a moment, Jake's mind flooded with warnings. Every lesson from his scouting days, every story he'd heard about what happened to white men who crossed invisible lines, every reason to turn around, mount his horse, and ride back to the safety of not knowing. But then she stirred, her eyes opening just slightly, and in that fractured second, he saw something that bypassed every logical thought. He saw pain. He saw a human being bleeding out on the sand, and he couldn't walk away. Jake knelt beside her, his hands hovering, uncertain. She flinched when he reached for her, trying to pull away despite her obvious weakness. He raised his palms, showing he was unarmed in that moment. His voice came out rough from disuse. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't understand his words. He could see that. But maybe she understood his tone. Or maybe she was just too weak to fight. Either way, she stopped struggling. The wound was in her side, a bullet graze, not deep but angry and infected. Bandits, Jake guessed. The territory crawled with them. Men without allegiance except to violence and whatever they could steal. He'd treated enough wounds to know this one needed care fast. But moving her, bringing her to his cabin, that was crossing a line he'd never imagined crossing. He thought of her people. Somewhere out in that vast territory, someone was looking for her. A father, a brother, a husband maybe. What would they think if they found one of their own in the hands of a white man? What would they do? Jake had seen what happened to those accused of lesser crimes against Apache families, and yet, if he left her here, she'd die by morning. The wound would take her, or the desert would, or the bandits would return to finish what they'd started. So Jake made a choice, the kind of choice that divides a man's life into before and after. He lifted her as gently as he could, feeling her body tense with pain, hearing the sharp intake of her breath. She was light, too light, her frame worn by something more than just this injury. Hunger, maybe. Or months of running. He carried her to his horse, speaking low and steady, the way he'd speak to a frightened animal. Not because he thought she was an animal, but because tone transcends language, and he needed her to know she was safe. The ride back to his cabin felt longer than any trail he'd ever ridden. Every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. Every crack of a twig made his heart hammer against his ribs. He kept expecting arrows to come whistling out of the darkness, kept expecting to hear the war cries that would mean his death. But the desert remained quiet, almost too quiet, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. When they reached the cabin, Jake kicked open the door and laid her on his bed, the only soft place in the entire sparse structure. He lit the oil lamp, and in its golden glow, he finally saw her clearly. She was young, maybe 20 summers, if that. Her face was sharp with pain, but beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness. This was a face carved by wind and sun and survival. Strength lived in the line of her jaw, in the set of her eyes, even through the haze of fever. Jake worked quickly. He cleaned the wound with water he'd boiled, using strips torn from his only good shirt. She cried out once, a sound that cut through him like glass, but didn't pull away. Her eyes stayed on his face the whole time, studying him, trying to understand what kind of man he was, what kind of threat, what kind of fool would risk everything for a stranger. When he finished bandaging her side, he sat back, suddenly aware of how close they were, how intimate this moment was, despite the circumstances. He could see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing, the sheen of sweat on her forehead, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket he'd pulled over her. She was terrified, of him, of this place, of what came next. "You're safe here," Jake said again, knowing she didn't understand the words but hoping she might understand the promise behind them. He pointed to himself. "Jake," then gestured to her with a questioning look. She stared at him for a long moment, fever-bright eyes searching his face. Then, barely a whisper, she spoke. "Nita." The name hung in the air between them like smoke. "Nita." Jake repeated it softly, testing the shape of it in his mouth. She closed her eyes then, exhaustion finally claiming her, her body surrendering to the need for rest. Jake stood, every muscle in his body aching with tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He looked at this woman, Nita, lying in his bed, wrapped in his blankets, bleeding into his bandages. And he knew, with a certainty, that settled, like stone in his chest, that nothing would ever be the same. He'd crossed a line tonight, not just the invisible boundary between territories, but something deeper, something that couldn't be uncrossed. The canyon that separated their worlds had seemed impossible to bridge. But here she was, and here he was. And the distance between them was nothing more than the space between her breathing and his. Jake pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down, revolver across his lap, eyes on the door. If her people came, if anyone came, he'd have to face what he'd done. But for now, in the quiet of that small cabin, with the lamp burning low and the desert wind whistling through the cracks in the walls, there was only this: a woman who needed help and a man who couldn't walk away. Sometimes that's all love is at first, a choice to stay when every instinct screams to run. 3 days passed like held breath. Nita burned with fever that first night, her body fighting the infection that had taken root in her wound. Jake barely slept, changing her bandages, bringing water to her lips, wiping her forehead with cool cloths as she muttered in Apache. Words he couldn't understand, but that sounded like prayers or memories or maybe accusations, against a world that had brought her to this. On the second day, the fever broke. Jake woke from a brief, exhausted doze to find her eyes open and clear, watching him with an intensity that made him straighten in his chair. She didn't speak. Neither did he. They simply looked at each other in the grey morning light. Two strangers connected by an act of mercy that neither fully understood yet. She reached down slowly, lifted the edge of the bandage, examined his work. When she looked back at him, something had shifted in her expression. Not trust exactly, but acknowledgement. He'd helped her. That much was undeniable. By the third day, Nita could sit up without gasping in pain. She watched everything Jake did with hawk-like attention. When he prepared food, her eyes followed his hands. When he cleaned his rifle, she studied the movements. When he stood at the window looking out toward the canyon, she noticed the tension in his shoulders. The way he kept checking the horizon like a man expecting trouble. Because they both knew trouble was coming. It was only a question of when. Jake tried to communicate through gestures. He pointed to things and said their names in English: table, water, bread, fire. Nita listened but didn't repeat the words. Not yet. She was still deciding about him, still measuring whether he was captor or savior or something more complicated than either. And Jake understood that caution. In her position, he'd be wary too. She was in a white man's cabin, injured and alone, with no way of knowing his intentions. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Jake had gone outside to chop wood, giving her space, giving himself something to do with the restless energy that came from days of confinement and waiting. He was mid-swing when he heard it, her voice, clear and deliberate, speaking from the doorway. "Jake?" He turned. She stood there, one hand braced against the doorframe, still weak but upright. She pointed to herself. "Nita," then pointed to the axe in his hands and spoke a word in Apache. When he looked confused, she repeated it, then mimed the chopping motion. She was teaching him, the way he'd tried to teach her. Something broke open in that moment, some wall that neither of them had known how to breach. Jake set down the axe and walked toward her slowly. He pointed to the sun climbing the sky and said, "Morning." She repeated it, her accent wrapping around the English word like cloth around stone. "Morning." Then she pointed to the same sun and spoke the Apache word. Jake repeated it back, mangling the pronunciation so badly she almost smiled. Almost, but not quite. The moment was too fragile for smiling yet. Over the following days, they built a language between them. Not English, not Apache, but something new. A bridge made of gestures and single words and context and patience. She taught him how her people spoke of the land. How the canyon wasn't just rock and river, but a living thing with moods and memory. He taught her the names settlers gave to things, names that tried to claim and categorize what her people knew couldn't be owned. As Nita healed, she began to move around the cabin more freely. She studied his few possessions with curiosity. The worn Bible he never read but couldn't throw away. The tin cup he drank from, the photograph tucked into the frame of the mirror, showing a young woman with sad eyes. When Nita pointed to the photograph with a questioning look, Jake's throat tightened. "Sarah," he said. "My wife." He used the past tense without explaining further. Nita understood death. Every Apache understood death. She touched the photograph gently, a gesture of respect, then moved on without pressing for details he wasn't ready to give. One evening, as the sun painted the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust, Nita sat outside the cabin on the step. Jake joined her after a moment's hesitation, sitting close enough to talk, but far enough to maintain the careful distance they'd been keeping. She spoke softly in Apache, her words flowing like water. He didn't understand most of it, but he understood the tone. She was telling him something important. Her story, maybe, or a story about her people. Or simply speaking because being silent was finally harder than speaking. When she finished, she looked at him expectantly. Jake cleared his throat. I don't know what you said." Nita nodded like she'd expected that. Then she picked up a stick and began drawing in the dirt. Simple shapes. A circle, she pointed to herself. Several more circles around it. Family, he guessed. Then she drew X marks through some of the circles. His chest tightened, dead. She was showing him who she'd lost. She drew more shapes. Men on horses, guns, a settlement. The story became clear even without words. Raiders had attacked. Not soldiers, not official, just men with guns and greed. Her family had scattered. She'd been shot running. Had been running for days before Jake found her. Jake stared at the drawings in the dirt, feeling the weight of what she'd survived. He picked up the stick from her hand, their fingers brushing for just a second, a jolt of connection that made them both pull back slightly. He began his own story in the dirt. A uniform, battles, a house, a woman. Then X marks through the woman. Fever, he'd told people. But the truth was more complicated. Sarah had died of grief as much as illness. Grief at what the war had turned him into. Grief at the violence he'd brought home in his bones even after the fighting ended. They sat there as darkness fell, their stories drawn in dirt that would blow away by morning. But something had been shared, something essential. They weren't just stranger and stranger anymore. They were two people who'd survived what shouldn't be survived, who'd lost what couldn't be replaced, who'd somehow found themselves sitting side by side on the edge of two worlds, trying to figure out which world they belonged to now, if any. That night Jake gave Nita the bed again and made himself a pallet on the floor. But sleep came harder than before. He was too aware of her presence, the sound of her breathing, the rustle of blankets when she shifted, the way the moonlight through the window touched her face when he glanced over, and he was glancing over too often, he knew. Something was growing between them, not the sudden, explosive attraction of storybooks, but something deeper, something built on survival and silence and the strange intimacy of being each other's only human contact in a world that wanted them separate. In the darkness, Nita's voice came softly. She spoke in Apache, a sentence he couldn't translate. But then she repeated it in the broken English she'd been learning. "You, good man." 3 words, simple, but they hit Jake like a physical force. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she didn't know him, didn't know the things he'd done during the war, didn't know how many good men would say he was the furthest thing from good for harboring her here. But he didn't say any of that. He just whispered into the darkness, "You're safe here. Nita, I promise," and meant it with every part of himself. The next morning, Jake woke to find Nita already up, moving around the cabin with more ease than she'd had since arriving. She'd made coffee, figured out his pot and the process just from watching him do it days before. When she handed him a cup, their eyes met and held. Something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, yes, but also recognition. They saw each other, not as Apache and white man, not as enemy sides of an invisible war, but as people, complicated, wounded, trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to make survival as hard as possible. Jake took the coffee, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something like hope stirring in his chest. It was dangerous, he knew. This hope, this connection. Every logical part of his brain screamed warnings. But the heart has its own logic, and his heart was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, the canyon that separated their worlds wasn't as wide as everyone claimed. Maybe it could be crossed. Maybe it already had been. In the quiet moments of tending wounds and sharing stories and learning each other's languages. Maybe love didn't need permission from the world to exist. Maybe it just was. By the second week, Nita's wound had healed enough that she could walk the perimeter of Jake's small homestead without pain. But she didn't leave. Jake didn't ask her to. They'd fallen into a rhythm, a pattern of days that felt almost normal despite how strange their situation was. Mornings, Jake would hunt or check his traps. Afternoons, they'd work on the cabin together. Small repairs, gathering firewood, tending the modest garden. Evenings, they'd sit and continue building their bridge of words. Nita taught him about the plants that grew wild around the canyon. She showed him which ones healed, which ones killed, which ones were sacred to her people. She'd kneel beside a cluster of sage, running her fingers over the silver-green leaves, speaking in Apache, then struggling to find the English. "This, for smoke, for clean?" She made a gesture of wafting smoke over herself. Jake understood. "Purification," he said. She repeated it carefully. "Purification." Then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It changed her entire face, made her look younger, softer, like the weight she carried might be bearable after all. That smile did something to Jake, made his chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear or pain. He looked away quickly, focusing on the sage, on the lesson, on anything but the way that smile had affected him. This was dangerous territory, more dangerous than the land itself. Because feelings like this, feelings between people like them. Those feelings had consequences that extended far beyond just the two of them. One evening, Nita began to sing. Jake was inside cleaning his rifle when he heard it, a voice rising from somewhere near the canyon's edge, where she often went to watch the sunset. The melody was unlike anything he'd heard before. Not the hymns from his childhood church, not the bawdy songs soldiers sang around campfires. This was something ancient, something that seemed to come from the earth itself. He walked to the door and saw her silhouetted against the dying light, her arms raised slightly, her voice carrying across the empty land. When the song ended and she turned to find him watching, she didn't look embarrassed, just tilted her head in that questioning way she had. Jake cleared his throat. That was beautiful. She understood beautiful. He'd taught her that word when pointing at a hawk circling overhead days ago. She smiled again, then gestured for him to come closer. When he did, she said, "My mother, song for—" She struggled for the word, then drew a circle in the air with her finger. "For all? For everything," Jake offered. She nodded. "For everything."
For earth.
For sky, for— She touched her chest. "Spirit?" Jake felt something shift inside him. His world had been so narrow for so long. Survival, solitude, the simple mechanics of existing one day after another. But Nita was opening something wider, showing him that there were ways of being in the world he'd never considered. Her people didn't just live on this land, they were part of it. Connected in ways his people spent their lives trying to sever with fences and deeds and the illusion of ownership. "Will you teach me?" Jake asked before he could stop himself. "The song?" Nita looked surprised, then thoughtful. She spoke in Apache, and though he didn't understand every word, he caught enough. She was asking if he was worthy of learning, if he understood what it meant to sing her mother's song. This wasn't entertainment. This was sacred. Jake met her eyes. "I want to understand," he said simply. "I want to understand your world." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Tomorrow," she said. "I teach tomorrow." That night, Jake lay on his pallet, unable to sleep. Above him, through the cracks in the roof, stars blazed in patterns that had guided travelers for millennia. He thought about boundaries, how much of his life had been spent respecting them, enforcing them, dying for them. North and South, Union and Confederate, White and Apache. All these lines drawn by men who claimed they were natural and inevitable and necessary. But lying there, listening to Nita's breathing across the room, those lines seemed less like laws of nature and more like choices that could be unmade. The next day, Nita kept her promise. She took him to a flat stretch of red rock overlooking the canyon and made him sit. Then she sang the song again, slower this time, breaking it into pieces he could learn. Jake's voice was rough and uncertain. He'd never been much of a singer, but he tried. He stumbled over the Apache words, pronounced them all wrong, lost the melody more times than he found it. But Nita was patient. She'd repeat the phrases, correct his pronunciation gently, show him where to breathe and where to hold the notes. By the time the sun reached its peak, Jake had learned maybe a quarter of the song. His throat was raw and his confidence shattered. But when he looked at Nita, she was smiling again, not mocking, something else. Pride, maybe. Or pleasure at sharing something precious with someone who wanted to learn. "Good," she said. "You good." He wanted to argue that he was terrible, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't judging his skill. She was honoring his effort, his willingness to step into her world and try to understand it on its own terms. "Your turn," Nita said suddenly, surprising him. "You teach," Jake blinked. "Teach you what?" She gestured broadly at the world. "Your song, your people song." Jake's mind went blank. What song? What did his people sing that could possibly compare to what she'd just shared? Then slowly something came to him. A melody his mother used to hum while cooking. Not from any church, not proper or formal. Just a simple tune she'd made up, or maybe inherited from her own mother. A song about morning light and coffee brewing and the small, quiet joys of being alive. Jake sang it, feeling foolish at first. His voice cracked on the high notes. The melody was so plain compared to hers. But as he sang, he closed his eyes and remembered his mother in the kitchen of the house that no longer existed. Remembered the smell of bread baking and the sound of her humming, and the feeling of being small and safe and convinced the world was good. When he finished, he opened his eyes to find Nita watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. She reached out, the first time she'd initiated touch, and placed her hand over his heart. "Good song," she said softly. "True song," Jake's breath caught, her hand on his chest. The warmth of it, the weight of it, they were close enough that he could see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes. Close enough that he could smell the sage she'd been gathering earlier. Close enough that all he'd have to do was lean forward slightly and... He pulled back, not sharply but deliberately. Nita let her hand fall, understanding in her face. They'd gotten too close, too comfortable. The reality of their situation came crashing back like cold water. They weren't just two people learning each other's songs. They were Apache and White. They were from worlds that had been at war for generations. This thing growing between them, whatever it was, it couldn't exist, not here, not anywhere. That evening they ate dinner in silence, not the comfortable silence they'd developed, but something heavy and awkward. Jake could feel the unspoken words piling up between them, the questions that had no good answers. What happens when she's fully healed? Where does she go? Can she go back to her people without putting them in danger? Can she stay here without putting Jake in danger? Can they keep existing in this suspended moment, or would the world eventually force them to choose sides they'd been trying to forget they were on? After dinner, Nita stood and walked to the door. She looked back at Jake. "Come," she said simply. He followed her outside into the night. The moon was nearly full, turning the canyon walls into silver ghosts. Nita walked toward the edge, where the land dropped away into darkness and distance. Jake followed, his heart hammering for reasons he didn't want to examine too closely. At the edge, Nita stopped. She pointed across the canyon to the far side, where the land stretched into Apache territory. "My people," she said. Then she turned and pointed back toward his cabin, toward the east, where settler towns glittered faintly in the distance. "Your people." She looked at Jake, and in the moonlight, her eyes seemed to hold all the sadness in the world. She gestured to the canyon between, the vast emptiness that had existed for millions of years and would exist for millions more. "Between," she said. Always between. Jake understood what she was saying. They were caught in the middle, neither here nor there, too connected to each other to pretend nothing had changed, but too trapped by their circumstances to imagine a future where connection was enough. The canyon was both metaphor and reality. It separated their worlds. It defined the impossible distance between what was and what could never be. But standing there in the moonlight, looking at her face, Jake felt something rebel inside him. Something that refused to accept that the canyon was unbreachable. Something that whispered maybe, just maybe. Love was its own kind of bridge. And bridges could be built, had to be built. Because the alternative was spending the rest of his life on one side, knowing she was on the other, and never having tried to cross. He didn't say any of this. How could he? His language and hers were still too limited, their understanding too fragile. But he reached out and took her hand, gently, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Her fingers closed around his, and they stood there at the edge of the canyon, holding on to each other, holding on to the possibility that maybe boundaries were just stories people told themselves. Stories that could be rewritten, if they were brave enough, if they were foolish enough, if they loved each other enough. Reality arrived on horseback 3 weeks after Jake found Nita. He was out checking traps when he saw the dust cloud rising from the east. Riders, multiple, coming fast. Jake's blood went cold. He sprinted back toward the cabin, his mind racing through possibilities. Soldiers, settlers, someone who'd seen smoke from his chimney and wondered who was living this far from town. He burst through the door to find Nita already moving, her instincts as sharp as his. She'd seen them too. Without a word, they worked together. Jake throwing supplies into his saddlebag, while Nita gathered the medicines she'd been making from local plants. They had maybe 15 minutes before the riders arrived. Maybe less. Jake's hands shook as he loaded his rifle. Not from fear for himself, from terror at what might happen to her. "You need to go," Jake said urgently. "Head west, into the canyon. Find your people." But Nita shook her head stubbornly. "They find me. They hurt you." She was right, and they both knew it. If she ran and the riders were tracking her, they'd know Jake had been harboring her. If she stayed, she'd be found. There was no good option, only choices between different kinds of catastrophe. The decision was made for them when the riders topped the rise. 5 men. Jake recognized 2 of them, former soldiers he'd served with during the war. His chest tightened. These weren't random settlers. They were looking for something, or someone. Jake stepped outside, positioning himself in front of the cabin door, casual, like he had nothing to hide, like his heart wasn't threatening to burst through his ribs. The lead rider, a man named Coleman, scarred and mean-eyed, pulled up his horse. "Marston," he said without warmth. "Been a while." Jake nodded, keeping his face neutral. "Coleman, what brings you out here?" Coleman looked past him at the cabin, suspicion clear in his expression. "Tracking Apache. Raiders hit a supply wagon 2 weeks back. Trail led this direction. You seen anything?" Jake's mind worked frantically. The truth would get Nita killed, but a lie they could disprove would get them both killed. "Haven't seen raiders," he said carefully. "Been keeping to myself." That much was true. He hadn't seen raiders. Coleman's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we look around?" "Make sure they didn't leave any evidence." It wasn't really a question. Jake stepped aside, his pulse thundering. Where was Nita? Had she hidden? Had she run? The men dismounted and pushed past him into the cabin. Jake followed, every muscle tensed, expecting shouting, expecting violence. But the cabin was empty, his bed neatly made. No sign anyone but him had been living there. No sign of the woman who'd been sleeping under those blankets for 3 weeks. Coleman walked through the small space, turning over Jake's few possessions, checking corners, looking for what evidence of Apache presence. A person. Jake kept his breathing steady, kept his hands relaxed at his sides, even as sweat slicked down his back. Where was she? One of Coleman's men opened the chest, where Jake kept his spare clothes. Empty except for shirts and worn pants. Another checked behind the cabin. Nothing. Finally, Coleman turned back to Jake. "You're living pretty sparse out here, Marston." "Lonely life," Jake shrugged. "I like the quiet." Coleman studied him for a long moment, and Jake could see him weighing, calculating, trying to decide if Jake was lying or just exactly what he appeared to be, a war-broken man hiding from civilization. Finally, Coleman spat into the dirt. "You see any Apache, you report it. Understand? These aren't peacetime Indians. These are killers. They don't deserve mercy." Every instinct screamed at Jake to argue, to defend Nita, to explain that she was the victim, not the aggressor. But he bit his tongue and nodded. "I'll keep watch." Coleman remounted his horse, and the others followed. As they prepared to leave, one of the younger men pointed toward the canyon. "Should we check down there?" Coleman shook his head. "Nothing in that canyon but rocks and rattlesnakes. If they went that way, they're someone else's problem." He looked back at Jake one more time. "Stay alert, Marston. These are dangerous times." Jake watched them ride east until they disappeared into the heat shimmer. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. His legs nearly gave out from the adrenaline crash. He turned slowly, scanning the area. "Nita?" he called softly. No answer. His heart lurched. Had she run? Had she thought he'd betray her? "Nita!" He called again, louder now, not caring who might hear. A sound from the root cellar. Jake rushed over and pulled open the door to find Nita curled in the darkness among sacks of potatoes and preserved goods. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw trust and fear warring. He reached down and helped her climb out. She was shaking, not from cold, from the closeness of it, from understanding how fragile their safety had been, how easily everything could have ended. "They're gone," Jake said. "You're safe." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. She wasn't safe. Neither of them were. That visit had made one thing absolutely clear. Their time was running out. They couldn't keep existing in this bubble. The world was closing in. And soon, very soon, they'd have to face the impossible choice they'd been avoiding. That night they didn't pretend anymore. They sat together on Jake's bed, not touching, but close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. Nita spoke first. "I must go." Her English had improved enough that the sentence came out almost perfect. Jake wanted to argue, wanted to say she could stay, that he'd protect her. But protection was an illusion. He was one man with one rifle against a world that wanted them apart. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice rough. Nita pointed west, toward the deeper Apache territory. "Find my brother, if he... alive." The word "if" hung between them like smoke. So much of her family was already gone. There was no guarantee her brother had survived, whatever had scattered them. But she had to try. She had to go back to her people. It was the only way she'd truly be safe. If safety even existed for Apache women anymore. Jake nodded slowly, understanding and hating it in equal measure. "When?" Nita looked at the window, where moonlight painted silver squares on the floor. "Soon before they come back." She was right. Coleman might have been fooled today, but men like him didn't stay fooled for long. And if he came back with more men, if he brought trackers who could read signs Jake had missed, there'd be no hiding place dark enough. They sat in silence for a long time. Jake wanted to say so many things. Wanted to tell her that these weeks had changed him, that she'd opened something in him he'd thought died with Sarah, that the idea of her leaving felt like losing a limb. But what good would words do? They couldn't change reality. They couldn't bridge the canyon that separated their worlds. Words were just words. It was Nita who finally broke the silence. She turned to face him, and in the moonlight her face was beautiful and terrible in its honesty. "Jake," she said, and hearing his name in her voice made his chest ache. "You saved me, not just..." She touched her side where the wound had been. "Not just body. You saved me." She touched her heart. "Here." Jake couldn't speak. His throat had closed around words that were too big, too dangerous to release. But Nita wasn't finished. She reached up and touched his face, gentle, questioning, giving him every chance to pull away. He didn't, couldn't. He leaned into her touch like a man starving for connection, for warmth, for the simple human comfort of being seen and chosen despite everything. "In my world," Nita said softly, "we have story about canyon, about man and woman from different sides they love, but worlds say no. So they..." She made a gesture he didn't understand, then tried again. "They become birds, fly over canyon, together, free." She smiled, but it was the saddest smile Jake had ever seen. "Beautiful story, but just story." Jake took her hand from his face and held it between both of his. "And maybe stories are true in ways we can't see yet," he said. "Maybe love that's strong. Maybe it does transform things, changes them, makes impossible things possible." He was reaching for hope, grasping at shadows. But what else did they have? Nita shook her head slowly. "Your people kill my people. My people kill your people. She gestured between them. "This is a borrowed time." The phrase was one Jake had taught her last week, explaining how some things couldn't last. She'd remembered. Of course she'd remembered. She forgot nothing. "Then let's borrow more," Jake said fiercely. "Stay one more week, one more day. Whatever you can give me, I'll take it. Because this..." Now it was his turn to gesture between them. "This matters more than all the hate in the world. What we have, it's real, it's true, and I'm not ready to let it go." He saw tears gathering in her eyes, the first tears he'd seen from her despite everything she'd endured. She blinked them back, but one escaped, trailing down her cheek. Jake caught it with his thumb, and that simple gesture broke something open between them. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway, and their lips touched in a kiss that was both gentle and desperate, a kiss that tasted like grief and hope and all the impossible futures they'd never have. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Nita pressed her forehead to his. "1 week," she whispered. "I stay." 1 week. It wasn't enough. Could never be enough. But it was what they had. So Jake nodded and pulled her close, and they held each other as the moon traced its arc across the sky, and the canyon wind sang songs only the ancient stones remembered. The week that followed existed outside of normal time. Jake and Nita moved through their days like people in a dream, aware that any moment could shatter the fragile reality they'd built. They spoke less and touched more. Simple touches, her hand on his shoulder as she passed, his fingers brushing hers when they worked together. Every touch was both affirmation and goodbye. Nita showed Jake how to read the land the way her people did, not just looking at the desert but listening to it, the way the wind changed direction before rain, the pattern of birds that signaled water nearby, the plants that grew only where the earth was rich and safe. She was giving him pieces of her knowledge, pieces of herself, like breadcrumbs he could follow after she was gone. Jake taught her English words she might need if she encountered settlers. Not friendly words, survival words. Help. Please. Don't shoot. Each lesson felt like a betrayal of the world he wanted to exist, a world where she'd never need to beg for mercy from his people. But he taught her anyway, because love sometimes means preparing someone for a future without you. On the 5th day, they rode together to a high point overlooking the canyon. From there, they could see for miles in every direction, east toward settler territory, west toward Apache lands, north and south along the canyon's endless length. They were tiny beneath that vast sky, 2 specks of human life in a landscape that had existed long before them and would exist long after. It made their problems seem both insignificant and unbearably heavy. "When I was small," Nita said, "my grandmother tell me, canyon is where Creator first breathed, where world began, she say. If you listen, you can still hear it, the first breath, the first word." She looked at Jake. "You hear it?" Jake closed his eyes and listened. He heard wind, heard the distant rush of the river far below, heard the cry of a hawk hunting, and beneath it all, maybe something else, a hum, a presence, something too big to name, but impossible to deny. "I hear it," he whispered, and he did. Or maybe he just wanted to believe he did. Maybe that was enough. Nita smiled, one of her rare, real smiles that made everything else fade. "Good," she said, "then you understand. A little." She leaned against him, and they sat that way as the sun moved across the sky, both aware that moments like this were numbered, that the count was running down, that soon there would be no more moments at all. That night they made love, not frantically, not with the passion of stolen moments, but slowly, carefully, like people trying to memorize each other, every touch, every breath, every whispered word in languages they were still learning. Afterward they lay tangled together, and Jake traced the scar on her side, the wound he'd cleaned and bandaged that first night. It had healed into a thin, white line, a reminder of how they'd found each other, of how close she'd come to dying before he'd known her name. "I'm afraid," Jake admitted into the darkness. He'd never said those words to anyone, not during the war, not after Sarah died. But he said them now, to her, because pretending felt more dangerous than honesty. "I'm afraid of losing you. I'm afraid of what comes after you leave. I'm afraid I'll forget the sound of your voice, or the way you look when the sun hits your face, or I'm just afraid." Nita turned in his arms to face him. Her fingers traced his jaw, his cheekbones, his lips, mapping him the way he'd been mapping her. "Fear is remembering," she said carefully. "If you not afraid, if you not hurt when I go, then this not matter. Pain is proof we real." Her logic was simple and devastating. The pain he felt at the thought of her leaving was evidence of how much this mattered, how much she mattered. There was strange comfort in that. If it hurt this much, at least it had been real. The next morning, the 6th day, everything changed. Jake woke to find Nita already up, standing at the window, her body tense. He joined her and saw what she was seeing. Smoke, rising from the west. Not cooking smoke, not a single campfire. Multiple columns of smoke stretching across the horizon, thick, black, the kind of smoke that came from burning structures, from destruction. "Your people," Nita said, her voice hollow. "They attack." Jake's stomach dropped. He grabbed his spyglass and trained it on the smoke. Even from this distance, he could make out movement. Riders, wagons, and the unmistakable formation of a military operation. They weren't just passing through, they were pushing into Apache territory, claiming land, burning what they found. This wasn't a patrol, this was an invasion. Nita turned to him and he saw something shift in her face. The gentleness that had been there moments ago was gone, replaced by something harder, something that reminded him she was a warrior's daughter, that her people had been fighting for survival long before he met her. "I go," she said, not a question, a statement of fact. Jake wanted to argue, wanted to tell her it was too dangerous, but he had no right to stop her. Her people were under attack. If her brother was still alive, he might be in the path of those flames. "I'll come with you," Jake said before he could think better of it. Nita's eyes widened. "No, they kill you. You, white. They see you. She made a gesture across her throat. Jake knew she was right. Apache warriors defending their territory wouldn't stop to ask questions about a white man riding beside one of their women. They'd shoot first if he was lucky, if he wasn't lucky. Well, he'd heard stories about what happened to captured soldiers. None of them ended well. "Then I'll go to the soldiers," Jake said, his mind racing. "I'll tell them to stop. I served. I know some of the commanders. Maybe I can—" But even as he said it, he knew how futile it sounded. One man's voice against military orders, against the machinery of expansion and conquest. He'd have better luck stopping the wind. Nita heard the defeat in his voice. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You cannot stop this," she said gently but firmly. "This, bigger than us, bigger than love, this is." She struggled for the English word. Then just gestured at everything, the smoke, the canyon, the vast indifferent sky. "This is world, world that hate, world that kill. We, just two people, we cannot change world." But Jake shook his head stubbornly. "Maybe we can't change the whole world, but we can change our piece of it. We can refuse to be part of the hate. We can choose differently, even if no one else does, even if it costs us everything." He was grasping at straws, at philosophy, at anything that might give them a path forward that didn't end in goodbye. But Nita's expression was resolute. She'd already made her choice. She kissed him, long and deep and final. When she pulled away, her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. "You give me life," she said. "You give me hope. I love you, Jake Marston. I love you in way that—" She touched her chest, searching for words. "In way that cross canyon, in way that last forever, but I must go. My people need, you understand?" He did understand, and he hated understanding. But he nodded. They packed her few belongings in silence. A deerskin bag with dried meat and the medicines she'd made. A water skin, a knife Jake insisted she take. She dressed in the Apache clothing she'd been wearing when he found her, repaired now, clean, but still marked with the faint stain of old blood. When she was ready, she turned to him one last time. "If world different," she started. Jake finished for her. "If the world was different, we'd have a lifetime." Nita nodded, tears finally spilling over. "Lifetime," she repeated, the word both promise and lament. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Jake watched her go, every instinct screaming at him to stop her, to lock the door, to keep her safe, even if it meant keeping her prisoner. But love wasn't possession. Love was letting go when staying meant death. She paused at the threshold and looked back. "Listen for me," she said. "At night, when wind blow through canyon, I sing for you. You listen, you hear me, always." It was such a small comfort, such an impossible promise. But Jake nodded. "I'll listen," he said. "Every night. I'll listen." And then she was gone, walking away from the cabin, away from safety, away from him. Jake stood in the doorway and watched her figure grow smaller against the vast landscape. She didn't look back again. Maybe it was easier that way. Maybe looking back would have broken her resolve. He watched until she disappeared into the canyon's maze of rocks and shadows, and even then he kept watching, as if his gaze alone could protect her from everything the world would throw at her. When he finally turned back to the empty cabin, it had never felt more empty. Her presence was gone, but traces of her remained everywhere. The coffee cup she'd used, the blanket she'd slept under, the sage she'd hung from the rafters to dry, each thing a reminder, each thing a wound. Jake sank into his chair and put his head in his hands, and for the first time since he was a boy, he wept. Not quiet tears, but great wrenching sobs that came from somewhere so deep he hadn't known it existed. He wept for her. For them, for the life they'd never have, for the world that made love between them a crime instead of a miracle. 3 days after Nita left, the violence came closer. Jake heard it before he saw it, the sound of rifles echoing across the canyon, the shouts of men engaged in combat. He climbed to his high point with the spyglass and saw the battlefield spread below. Soldiers in formation pushing west. Apache warriors using the canyon's geography to their advantage, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. It was brutal, it was senseless. It was exactly what Jake had spent the last month trying to pretend didn't exist. He wanted to do something, anything, but what? Ride into the middle of a firefight and beg both sides to stop. He'd be killed by the first bullet and nothing would change. So he stayed on his ridge and watched the war unfold, feeling like the worst kind of coward. Every shot that rang out could be the one that ended Nita. Every cry could be her voice. The not knowing was its own form of torture. That night the fighting stopped, but the smoke continued. Jake sat outside his cabin, listening to the wind, remembering Nita's promise. "Listen for me," she'd said. He listened. But all he heard was wind and the distant barking of coyotes and the silence of his own racing thoughts. Maybe her promise had been just comfort. Maybe there was no mystical connection, no way for her voice to carry across the canyon. Maybe love didn't transcend distance after all. Maybe it just ended. On the 4th day, Coleman returned. But this time he didn't come with questions. He came with accusations. Jake saw the dust cloud and knew before the riders arrived that this visit would be different. He stood in his doorway, rifle in hand, as Coleman and 6 men rode up. Their faces were hard, unforgiving. Jake's chest tightened. Someone had talked. Someone had seen something. The reckoning he'd been dreading had finally arrived. "You lied to me, Marston," Coleman said without preamble. "One of my men found tracks, fresh tracks, leading from your cabin toward Apache territory. And someone in town remembers seeing smoke from your chimney at odd hours. Like maybe you were cooking for more than one." Jake kept his face neutral, but his mind was racing. How much did they know? How much could he deny without making things worse? "I'm alone here," Jake said steadily. "Always have been." Coleman smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Then you won't mind us searching more thoroughly this time. And if we find any evidence you've been harboring the enemy, well..." He let the threat hang unfinished. Jake had no choice but to step aside. The men dismounted and tore through his cabin with purpose this time. They weren't looking for a person. They were looking for proof, and they found it. Of course they found it. Because Jake hadn't hidden anything. Why would he? He'd never imagined anyone would come looking. One of Coleman's men emerged from the cabin, holding the deerskin pouch Nita had made to carry herbs. Another held the blanket she'd wrapped herself in, woven with a pattern distinctly Apache. A third pointed to the marks on the floor where she'd drawn pictures in the dust, pictures Jake hadn't swept away because he couldn't bear to erase that last trace of her. Coleman walked up to Jake slowly, holding the pouch like evidence in a trial. "Apache," he said. "Fresh, recent." He looked Jake in the eyes. "Where is she?" Jake said nothing. He wouldn't give Nita up. Not if they tortured him. Not if they killed him. Some betrayals were worse than death. Coleman's expression hardened. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Marston. Tell us where the squaw went and we'll make it quick. Stay quiet and, well, we've got time. We've got rope. And we've got a real creative streak when it comes to traitors. I don't know what you're talking about, Jake said evenly. It was a weak lie. They all knew it was a lie, but it was the only lie he had. Coleman nodded to his men. Two of them grabbed Jake's arms, forced him to his knees. Another brought rope. They tied his hands behind his back, rough, the rope cutting into his wrists. Coleman crouched in front of him, close enough that Jake could smell tobacco and sweat and hatred. You think you're being noble, Coleman said, protecting her. But you're not saving anyone. We'll find her. We'll find all of them. This territory is being cleared, Marston. It's decided. It's done. Whether you help us or not, the outcome's the same. Only difference is whether you die here or in town where people can watch. Where people can learn what happens to white men who side with savages over their own kind. Jake met his eyes and said the only true thing he had left. She's not a savage. She's more human than any of you. More compassionate. More brave. You call her enemy because it's easier than admitting you're the ones bringing hell to her homeland. But I've seen both sides now, and I know which one has the moral ground. He knew the words would cost him, but he'd spent too long staying quiet. If these were his last moments, he'd spend them speaking truth. Coleman hit him hard. Jake tasted blood. The world spun. Another hit, then another. Jake stopped counting. Stopped feeling much of anything except the distant knowledge that his body was being damaged in ways he might not survive. But through the pain, one thought remained clear. He'd protected her. They didn't know where she'd gone. They didn't know if she'd found her brother. They didn't know anything except that Jake had harbored her, and now he'd pay the price. But she was free. That had to be enough. They threw him in the root cellar, the same place Nita had hidden from them. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. They left him there, hands still bound, bleeding from a dozen places, with Coleman's final words echoing, "Think about it. By morning, you tell us everything, or we make you wish you had." Then the door slammed shut, and Jake was alone in the darkness. He lost track of time. Minutes or hours passed. The pain became constant, indistinguishable from his own existence. He thought about Sarah, about how he'd failed to save her, about how he'd watched her fade and done nothing. But Nita he'd saved. At least once. Maybe that balanced some cosmic scale. Maybe that meant his life had mattered after all. Then in the darkness he heard it. Faint at first. So faint he thought he was hallucinating from blood loss. But it grew stronger. A voice, singing. The melody was Nita's song, the one she'd taught him, the one her mother had sung. But the voice wasn't coming from inside his head. It was coming from outside, from the canyon, carried on the wind just like she'd promised. Jake dragged himself to the cellar door. Through the cracks, he could see night had fallen. The stars blazed overhead, and the song continued, rising and falling like water, like breath, like the first word the Creator spoke into being. Nita was out there, somewhere in the canyon, singing for him, to him, telling him she was alive, telling him she remembered, telling him that love hadn't ended just because distance separated them. Tears streamed down Jake's face, mixing with the blood and dirt. He tried to sing back, his voice broken and raw, but he sang. The words he'd learned, the melody she'd taught him. If she could hear him, if his voice could carry even a fraction of the distance hers had, maybe she'd know he was still here, still listening, still loving her despite everything. Morning came with the sound of the cellar door opening. Jake blinked against the sudden light. Coleman stood silhouetted in the doorway, but his expression had changed. The cruel confidence was gone, replaced by something else, confusion, maybe even fear. He stared at Jake like he was seeing a ghost. "You hear that singing last night?" he asked. Jake said nothing. Coleman shook his head slowly. The boys heard it too. Said it sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. Like the canyon itself was singing. Some of them are spooked, saying this place is cursed. He cut Jake's bonds roughly. "Get out," he said. "Get out of this territory. Go back east. Go anywhere. But if I see you here again, if I hear you've helped even one Apache, I'll kill you myself. Understand? Jake understood. He was being exiled, being banished from the only place that mattered, because it was the last place he'd been with her. But he was alive, and that meant there was still a chance. Still hope. Still possibility. Jake stumbled out of the cellar, his body screaming protest with every movement. The men had already mounted their horses, clearly eager to leave. They rode out without another word, dust trailing behind them like guilt. Jake stood alone in the morning light, broken but breathing, and looked toward the canyon. He spent the next week healing, but he didn't leave. He couldn't, not yet, not without knowing. Every night he'd sit at the canyon's edge and listen. Sometimes he heard her song, sometimes just wind. But whether it was real or imagined didn't matter anymore. The distinction had stopped being important. What mattered was that the song reminded him to keep breathing, keep hoping, keep believing that love could exist even when the world insisted it couldn't. On the 8th night, he saw movement on the far side of the canyon. A figure, small, distant but unmistakable. Nita. She stood on a ridge silhouetted against the setting sun and raised one hand. Not waving, just acknowledging, seeing. Jake raised his hand in return. They stood that way as darkness fell. Two people separated by an impossible distance, connected by an invisible thread, stronger than stone. She didn't cross to him. He didn't try to cross to her. They both understood that some distances can't be bridged. Not yet, maybe not ever. But the distance didn't erase what they'd had. It didn't make their love less real. If anything, it proved how real it was. Because real love doesn't need proximity, doesn't need permission, doesn't need the world's approval to exist. Jake built a fire that night, a signal fire, a promise fire. He'd stay near the canyon, near her, not crossing the line that separated their worlds, but not abandoning it either, living in the space between. And across the canyon he saw another fire bloom to life, Nita's fire, answering his. Two flames burning in the darkness, separated by stone and history, and all the violence humanity could conjure, but burning nonetheless. Months passed this way. Jake would see her sometimes on the ridge. Sometimes she'd be alone. Sometimes there were others with her. Her people, he assumed, returned from wherever they'd scattered. She was home. She was safe. That knowledge settled something in Jake's chest. The ache of missing her never faded, but it became bearable, like an old wound that throbs before rain but doesn't stop you from living. One morning, Jake woke to find something new, a deerskin pouch hanging from a branch near his cabin. Inside, dried herbs, woven with the same pattern as the blanket Coleman's men had found, and a single white stone, smooth from river water. Jake held it in his palm, and he knew. She'd crossed in the night, come close enough to leave this, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her if he'd been awake. The thought made his heart ache with a sweetness that was almost unbearable. He made his own gift, a wooden carving, a bird in flight, wings spread rising. He'd been working on it for weeks, teaching his clumsy hands to shape something beautiful from rough wood. He left it on her ridge at dawn, then retreated to watch from a distance. She found it that evening. He saw her pick it up, saw her stillness as she studied it, saw her press it to her chest. Then she looked across the canyon, and even though miles separated them, Jake felt the weight of her gaze, the gratitude, the love, the understanding that this was how they'd exist now, in gestures and gifts, in the space between touching and not touching. Years passed. The war between settlers and Apache continued, but the violence moved north, following the same destructive pattern to new lands, new peoples, new excuses for cruelty. Jake stayed at his canyon. Nita stayed at hers. Sometimes he'd go months without seeing her. Then she'd appear on the ridge, and his heart would remember how to beat properly again. They were growing older, he realized. The desert was marking them both. But the canyon remained unchanged, eternal, indifferent to human struggles, a reminder that their love was just one small story in an endless landscape of stories. One autumn evening, Jake sat at the canyon's edge as the sun painted everything gold. He was older now, grayer, slower. The years had taken their toll, but his heart His heart was rich with a love that hadn't dimmed. He heard footsteps behind him and turned, expecting nothing, expecting solitude as always. But there she was, Nita, older too, silver threading through her black hair, but unmistakably her. Impossibly close, real enough to touch. Jake stood slowly, his body protesting, his mind refusing to believe. She'd crossed. After all these years of living in the space between, she'd actually crossed. Nita. Her name came out like a prayer. She smiled. That same smile that had first cracked his defenses open all those years ago. Jake, his name in her voice. Still accented. Still beautiful. Still the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. How? He asked. She gestured back the way she'd come. My brother, gone, my people, scattered. I am alone, like you. There was grief in her voice, but also something else. Liberation. The ties that had kept her on her side of the canyon had loosened. Not gone. She'd carry that loss forever, but loosened enough that she could finally cross. Could finally choose him over everything else. Jake reached for her hands, and she took them without hesitation. They stood at the canyon's edge, holding each other, both of them crying, both of them laughing, both of them alive, despite everything that had tried to kill them. The canyon, Jake said, looking out at the vast space that had separated them for so long. It didn't keep us apart. It kept us waiting until the time was right, until we'd earned this. Nita nodded. My grandmother. She was right. Canyon is where world began, and where our world begins. New world, together. They walked back to Jake's cabin hand in hand. Two people who'd spent years separated by an impossible divide, finally on the same side. Finally home. Not because the world had changed, it hadn't. Not because the hate had ended, it hadn't. But because they'd found a way to love despite the canyon. To build a bridge from nothing but persistence and faith and the stubborn belief that love mattered more than all the forces arrayed against it. That night, as they sat by the fire, Nita began to sing the song her mother had taught her, the song she'd sung across the canyon to let him know she was alive. But this time Jake sang with her, his voice still rough, still imperfect. But together, their voices wove something new, not Apache, not white, but something that belonged to them alone, a song of the space between, a song of love that had survived every attempt to silence it. And in the darkness beyond the firelight, the canyon wind carried their voices across the stones that had witnessed 1,000,000 loves and losses. The canyon didn't care about their happiness or their suffering. It simply was, eternal and indifferent. But Jake and Nita, they cared. They'd chosen to care, chosen to love, chosen to believe that two voices singing together could matter in a world that insisted they shouldn't even exist in the same space. That's the thing about love, isn't it? It doesn't need the world's permission. It doesn't require perfect circumstances or the absence of obstacles. It just needs two people willing to keep showing up, keep trying, keep believing that the distance between them, whether a canyon or a century or the weight of history itself, is crossable. Not easily, not without cost, but crossable. Jake and Nita lived out their days at the edge of that canyon. They were never fully accepted by either world. Settlers who knew Jake's story called him traitor. Apache who learned of Nita's choice called her lost. But labels only matter if you let them. And they'd spent too long earning each other to care about the judgments of people who'd never tried to cross their own canyons, who'd never loved someone they weren't supposed to love, who'd never learned that the hardest bridges to build are the ones that matter most. When Jake died, many years later, his hand in Nita's, his eyes on the canyon that had defined his life, his last words were simple. Thank you. Thank you for crossing. Thank you for staying. Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't end at boundaries. It begins there. Nita held him as he slipped away, and she sang the old song. The one her mother taught her. The one she'd taught him. The one they'd made their own. And when Nita died, sometime after, her body wrapped in deerskin, her face turned toward the sunset, she went with a smile. Because she'd lived a life that mattered. She'd loved someone who'd saved her not just once, but every day after. She'd proven that the canyon wasn't an ending, It was a threshold, a place where impossible things became possible for those brave enough to cross. Their graves sit side by side on the ridge overlooking the canyon. Two simple markers, two names, no dates, no explanations, just Jake and Nita, separated by a space so small you could step over it without noticing. But that space tells the whole story. The distance they'd crossed, the world they'd built, the love that had survived every attempt to destroy it. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows through the canyon just right, people say you can still hear it. The song, two voices woven together, singing the ancient melody that predates every border humans ever drew. It's called the whisper now, the whisper beyond the canyon. A reminder that love is stronger than hate, that connection is more powerful than division, that two people choosing each other can matter more than all the armies and all the laws and all the forces that insist on keeping people apart. The canyon remains, unchanged, uncaring, eternal, but the whisper is proof that human love can echo through stone and time and every barrier erected to silence it. That's what Jake and Nita left behind, not answers, not easy lessons, but proof. Proof that crossing the impossible divide is possible, difficult, costly, painful, but possible. And that, in the end, might be the only hope any of us have. That love, real love, the kind that sees across canyons and chooses connection despite consequence. That love can exist, can persist, can matter in a world determined to make it impossible. Their story isn't a fantasy. It's not a fairy tale where everything works out perfectly. It's a testament to what's possible when two people refuse to accept that distance is destiny. When they build bridges one word at a time, one gesture at a time, one choice at a time. The canyon is still there. You can visit it, stand where they stood, look across the distance they crossed, and if you're very quiet, if you listen the way Jake learned to listen, you might hear it too. The whisper, the song that proves love is real, even when the world insists it isn't. Especially then. That's when love matters most, when it's forbidden, when it's impossible, when it requires everything you have just to keep believing it exists. Jake and Nita's love didn't change the world. The wars continued, the divisions remained, the hate persisted, but their love changed them. Made them more than they would have been alone, taught them that choosing connection over comfort, love over loyalty to tribes, understanding over ease, that these choices define what it means to be human, not in the abstract, but in the daily practice of reaching across divides that seem uncrossable. That's their gift to us. The whisper, the promise that love can exist in the space between worlds, that it doesn't need perfect conditions to thrive. It just needs two people brave enough to say, I see you, I choose you, I will cross every canyon to reach you, and then doing it, every day, despite everything, until the distance becomes not something that separates, but something that connects. A canyon spanned by the invisible bridge of two hearts that refuse to beat separately. Listen, can you hear it? The whisper beyond the canyon. It's still singing, will always be singing. As long as there are people willing to cross impossible distances for love, as long as there are bridges to be built and canyons to span, and hearts brave enough to try, the whisper reminds us that we're not alone in our crossings, that others have walked this path before, that love, true love, always finds a way. Even when the way seems impossible, even when the canyon seems too wide, even when the world screams that you should turn back. Jake and Nita never turned back. They crossed. They stayed crossed. They built a life in the space that everyone else said couldn't exist. And their story lives on, not in history books, not in official records, but in the wind, in the stones, in the whisper that carries across the canyon when the conditions are just right, when someone stands at the edge, heart breaking with love or longing, or the ache of separation, and listens, really listens. They hear it, the promise, the proof, the song that says, you can cross this, You can love across this divide. It will cost you, but it's possible. We did it. So can you. That's the final gift Jake and Nita left. Not certainty, not ease, but possibility. The knowledge that love is stronger than the forces that try to contain it. That choosing someone despite impossible odds isn't foolishness. It's the bravest thing a human can do. That every canyon can be crossed if you're willing to build the bridge step by step, word by word, choice by choice, until suddenly you're on the other side and the impossible has become your reality. The whisper beyond the canyon. It's not just their story. It's every story of love that refused to be bounded by borders. Every couple who chose each other despite the world saying no. Every heart that reached across a divide everyone else called uncrossable. It's proof that humanity's greatest power isn't in our weapons or our walls or our ability to separate. It's in our capacity to connect, to see across difference, to love across distance, to build bridges where everyone else sees only emptiness. So listen, when the wind blows through whatever canyon you face, when the distance between you and what you love seems impossible, when every voice tells you to turn back, to accept the divide, to stay on your safe side of the world, listen. You might hear it, the whisper, Jake's rough voice and Nita's clear one, woven together in a song that transcends every boundary, telling you what they learned at such great cost. Love is the bridge. Always has been. Always will be. You just have to be brave enough to cross. Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.